Hello and welcome to this video tutorial for ImagineFX magazine for world building and colour in concept art and illustration. I am going to guide you through the processes and the thoughts that I went through when creating the image that I'm presuming you've seen. It's in the magazine, and the kind of methods that I employ for building that kind of richness or what's around the corner kind of thing within an image. So I hope you find it useful, and let us begin. Okay, so I tend to recommend that when you're trying to come up with a world, you should grab some reference that really speaks to you and decide on some shapes that you really like the look of. Because when you're trying to sketch from absolutely nothing, it is a little bit of a challenge. The blank canvas is a cruel mistress, and especially if you're having to do something for a deadline or something that isn't just fun, relaxing personal work, believe me, speaking from experience here, you will end up putting too much pressure on yourself. So give yourself a break and find yourself a lovely bit of reference. Make a mood board if you can, and just find the things where you're looking at them and saying, yep, that is what I want, because that will absolutely pull you back to the things that matter to you, rather than just noodling away at something that loses the kind of creative vision that you initially had. Also, if you're trying to tell a story, I'd keep that in mind from the get-go. I am in this. You can see I've got these arching kind of tree things, some weird formations, a kind of high horizon line, and clouds. And what I'm going for here is the like the kind of feeling of it being a bright morning, and there are people that work here. Maybe it's like some kind of delivery time, and they grow plants and flowers, maybe for medicine, maybe for decoration, but they have a little house built in a very organic manner, with interesting structures. There's not really much more that I've got going on in my mind than that right now. But as you'll see as I work, you will kind of get the feeling that a lot of this is done in an organic manner, which it is. And that's totally fine. How you work is completely personal to you. And if this doesn't resonate with you, that's okay. It is all right to not work in this way. I, as you will see very quickly, don't particularly like working in shape. This wasn't giving me any good ideas. Like, I did not like this building whatsoever. So I'd say listen to what kind of reverberates with your creativity, because in a minute I'm going to go into working in line, which is way more creative for me because it allows me to get those small details in. If you are a kind of very broad brush strokes look and feel kind of concept artist or illustrator, then obviously you're going to maybe be drawn toward using those big brush strokes. But if you're looking to get intimate little details, and that's the thing that inspires you about painting, I find it always helps to, oh here we go, up-res it, and I merge everything down to one layer and just go in and start drawing, because I tell stories as I work, and I will expand and reduce the amount of detail that I've got in images, because as I'm doing that, I get to tell stories as I go, and it's really good fun. So right now, as you can see, I've started going in. I'm detailing a lot, but I find this very cathartic as well. I think you've got to allow yourself, if you're trying to create something that's kind of long running, to give your brain a little bit of downtime. So I'm just making the beginnings of houses, trying to feel out what kind of buildings they are. I will eventually not go with this kind of dome-shaped building, because I kind of want something that contrasts with the arches of the trees. But I am putting in, for example, for a while I was thinking they might have machines that could pick the flowers from the trees. I didn't go with that in the end because it just kind of, the silhouette was a bit uncomfortable. But I'm already considering how this world works, because when you're trying to expand on, like, trying to create a world that feels tangible and has detail in it, paying attention to how the world works is a brilliant way of just framing it. So pay attention to the materials that they use. Pay attention to how people get to that cool floating platform. It won't feel, it'll feel less connected. And sometimes that's fine. If it's just an image where you want something to look really cool, then that's okay. But when you're trying to build something that feels like it exists somewhere and you could go visit it and you can see the existence of people living there, then you want to pay attention to those little details. Like, for example, that hint in the top left, that's some bunting that they've slung around a rooftop because they can, I guess, because they find it nice to decorate with that. And here is it. That was a great example of a catastrophic failure. It also, in this painting, you will see me mess up an awful lot. That is pretty common. When I'm trying to decide on what interests me, I will start little compositions and then decide, no, that doesn't work. And that's kind of the organic process as I go through trying to figure out how everything appeals to me. And it's at this point that I realized that I wanted there to be some kind of delivery ship, and I wanted it to be tied in terms of material with all of the plant life. Because they're growing plants, how would they transport the plants? If I want it to be a floating ship, I mean, they could be open air, and then you get the really nice silhouette of all of these plants spilling out of the top of these airships. So I looked at the roof shape that I was considering, and it's kind of like coming up to a point. So I just cut the top of that point off and filled it with plants. And once again, this is me reducing down, trying to streamline the shapes and get the colour that I want. You'll also notice that I didn't go into black and white straight away. I go straight into colour. And if you like going straight into colour, as long as you're keeping an eye on your values, which straight up I am not doing right now. Like, this is my own failure. Don't be me. Keep an eye on your black and white values. Make sure that you've got some nice atmospheric perspective to kind of drop the scene back a little bit, give your painting a sense of depth. But yeah, I'm zooming really far out because sometimes I get caught up in stuff. I think although I'm talking a lot about detail, you do kind of have to still keep that big picture mindset as well, because it is so early on in the stage of the painting. I've also started picking like those highlight colours. I've got that red for the rooftops. I'm also kind of defining the shapes that I want to continue on in my image. So we've got these very graphical blocky clouds that I want to really highlight the height at which these buildings are. So, however, yeah, it's interesting watching this actually, because I don't often watch myself paint. And I work incredibly organically, and that's fine. I mean, it gets a little bit messy because I will just decide to render something out when the inspiration strikes me, but that is perfectly okay if I'm doing something for myself. I also mix a lot of colours. I pull a lot of stuff around in the image, so you'll see me pulling colours down from the sky down into the clouds, down into the plants, and I'll take like the warmer tones and pull them down into the earth colours. And it's this really good way of making your environment feel kind of not homogeneous, but feel connected. It's got this very tangible colour palette that all ties into each other while still having different tones and that kind of thing. So it keeps the eye moving around the image, but it doesn't feel too disconnected. Although then, I introduce some kind of weird lilac, and I'm not sure if I agree with that. But yeah, so when you are doing world building, you really want to focus on creating like a set of rules for your world. I try to make stuff feel grounded, but and when I say rules, I mean like what kind of materials are you using? What kind of tech do they have? Do they have magic? Do they have a certain, I mean, class structure isn't really a thing in this image, but you can definitely consider like their financial status and how they would decorate their homes. This isn't meant to feel like a wealthy kind of home whatsoever. It's meant to be very rural and kind of tucked away in the mountains a little bit. So I'm not going for anything particularly extravagant here. The house is a little bit tumble down, as most of my houses tend to be. It's meant to feel remote as well. And I think that's highlighted by this big open sky. You can use composition and the setting elements to make kind of like hammer home the feeling of the piece that you're trying to put across. So if you've got like these big open skies and this empty kind of scene, you want to make it feel maybe a little bit lonely. And these just few kind of orangish, kind of coral orange points sticking out from the trees as the only sign of life across this massive plain, which is why, I guess, in my mind, they're using these kind of very nippy looking hovercrafts, which are right now currently just sketches. And I mean, it doesn't quite come across now, but the buildings that I've gestured in are kind of like bubbles. Those are bubbles as well, like biodome kind of things where they grow things in the greenhouse. So I'm also considering how they perform the job that they're doing. How do they provide the service of growing flowers? And that little bubble dome, it's also part of the buildings. So it's like they have houses which also have like a greenhouse element to them. And then, even though I've want to get painted out that, the ship has that bubble dome feeling as well, because having those consistent forms is a really great way of tying a world together as well. Just continuing to repeat elements makes things feel cohesive. I don't know if you've seen, what's it called? The McMansion Hell. That's what it's called. If you haven't seen McMansion Hell, it basically goes into all of the ways that these, I think, mid-noughties houses were built very cheaply and quickly, that were meant to look big and dramatic and just convey wealth, and had all these different eras of architecture built into them, and as a result they just look terrible. Like, they had these big vaulted ceilings that didn't make any sense, combined with strange windows, multiple different shapes of windows, and it just resulted in really bad design work. And so that's the opposite of what I'm trying to go for here. I'm finding repeating shapes. So you can see I've got these blocky cloud kind of shapes, although I'm not really enjoying them. So I'm just going to go in and get rid of them because I want a nice feeling of depth. But finding repeating elements, I tend to go for very angular stuff to tie your image together. Is always a good way to get that feeling of cohesion. And also, don't be afraid to make big drastic changes. Photoshop has a lot of things that it can do for you in terms of content aware fill, which you can find in edit under fill, and that will be a great way of blocking in areas that you're not entirely sure about, and Photoshop can give you a really good head start with that. You can also free transform. You'll see later on I make some really big changes to the composition just because it doesn't feel quite right. And there's this concept of idea debt, and I think it's still very pervasive in terms of painting as well, that when you are working and you get really caught up in a certain image, or you spend a lot of time on something, once you've spent that time on something, even if you don't like it, you have a tendency to stick to it, right? Because you've spent that much time trying to create something and get it to work. But very much like when you have an idea and it's sticking in your head and you've wanted to do it for so long that you've been holding off on other things, it just holds you back. So really try and fight against that feeling of, I have dedicated a lot of time to what doesn't feel right. Trust your gut when you're creating images like this. If something doesn't feel right, it's probably because it isn't right. I'm a very instinctive painter, and I will go with what feels correct to me. I think that also ties into the whole murder your darlings thing or kill your darlings. If something doesn't fit properly, I might be really happy with how some of the foliage is coming along, but if it doesn't fit properly, I've got to get rid of it because it doesn't work. Don't hesitate to make really bold choices, especially in early stages of the painting. I think that this image probably would have come together a lot faster if I wasn't cripplingly self-aware that I was having every single failed brush stroke recorded. But I definitely could have made bolder choices, especially from the get-go. So in terms of colour, what I'm doing here, I'm trying to define the darker tones. You can see I'm playing with some more kind of like blue-greens. But that doesn't really, if you're looking at it now, it doesn't really sit right. I feel like I'm trying to push the blues in the shadow a bit more, but I'm not really that happy with that choice of green. Like, I think it needs to be worked in a little bit more. As you can see, just pushed back a bit. So it feels a bit more natural. Underpainting is a really good way of getting some nice tones in whilst still being able to maintain like color consistency. So underpainting is when you put like much brighter colors down to begin with, and then you start to work into them and bring them back to reality, as it were. Another piece of reference imagery that I liked had a lot of rock formations in it. So a lot of foliage coming down on rock formations. I think it's really important. Oh, flip your image. It's a reminder, flip your image. It's always good. Then you realise that your composition is horribly tilted to one side. But kind of figuring out the kind of rocks that would be in your environment. What kind of geological formations are you looking for here? I mean, it helps you define the climate as well, right? If there's a lot of moss on those rocks, it feels very lush. It became very obvious to me that when I was using all of these kind of sandy browns, it didn't mix quite right with all of the lush tones that I was using. And when I boost the saturation up, which is something I always do because I can't resist some good saturation, realizing what kind of story you're trying to tell here and what kind of environment these people are existing in, you need to pay attention to the color choices that you're using, because otherwise it sends mixed messages. Because right now this feels both lush and a bit dried out. So I am going to go in later and push some nice little highlights. And once again, don't be afraid to dramatically reduce what you're doing. I've got the sketch layer on another layer, so I can go back and refer to it at any time. But working with a big brush, it's very freeing, and it allows you to make big decisions and define planes. One thing that I think I wasn't happy with for a long time is the fact that these two kind of plateaus feel like they're existing on the same plane of an image, which I will change later. But it gives you a little bit of clarity to define the areas that you're working on more clearly with a big brush. And there are some of the more kind of lush tones that I want to put in. I really want this area to feel alive and linked with nature, as it were, even though that sounds really, really hippie-ish. I want it to feel as lush and magical as possible, and paying attention to things that make you feel like that, right? Like, I'm definitely, as per usual, shamelessly ripping off Howl's Moving Castle with those clouds drifting lazily across the horizon line, casting those almost warm shadows. Like, they're blue, but in that environment, you know that with that big sky, it would feel, maybe there'd be a brisk wind. But then again, the trees aren't moving, so it's probably quite a warm, fresh morning. I haven't gone too far into complete summer colours. There's no kind of oranges that feel hot. Nothing feels really hot in this. It feels fresh, but it doesn't feel like it's burning hot. So I want to push that fresh spring morning feeling. So you've got those very clean white tones as well, with the contrast, just the little hints of lilac that make it feel very fresh. Think about how they advertise like laundry detergent. It's always like white and blue and purple and pale yellow to make things feel fresh and clean. That's always a good way to work out the visual language, because if anyone's worked out how visual language works, it's advertisers. But what I'm looking for is signifiers for things being nice. So if you look at the ground that I'm rendering right now, you've got that dappled lighting, and everyone likes dappled lighting, you guys. Like, it just is pleasant to look at. It makes the world feel kind of safe and familiar and pleasant. And it also is interesting to look at. And just adding depth, that kind of thing. It'll definitely be in this image, there's a ricochet between the really intense periods of creativity and the gentle noodling and rendering in an image. And I think that's very necessary. I find that if I can just let my brain switch off and render out some grass, I will just start developing the stories that I want to tell in this image. Because right now I am just kind of creating the basis of a world. Like you can see, I put some slightly more saturated purples in there, a little bit of burnt sienna color. But right now I'm just thinking and considering where I want to take this image next. It's very much a happy accident kind of process of working, because one minute you can find yourself doodling one thing, and then you can start putting in what you realize is going to be a defining characteristic of your painting. You can be defining stronger light sources because you've given yourself a little bit of downtime, and I think that downtime is a really good way of balancing the way that you approach an image, because I get tired out if I just spend the entire time generating ideas. So be kind to yourself. Understand that you will need some time to just process the image. And as you can see, I've got the kind of glass domes coming in there now. Although they don't get communicated quite as effectively as I'd like. But that'll come later. One thing that I've been trying to do more of recently is push for darker values in the little corners of images, because if you have an issue with making your images a little bit too flat, I would say pay a lot of attention to areas with a lot of shadow to them, and make sure that you get some really saturated dark tones in there. Like saturated, for example, in the corner of that cone-shaped roof, that is a very it's a saturated green, I believe, or like a kind of blue-green, because those are the cool tones. And then also you can add in some really saturated reflected light as well. And there's a little bit of purple going in there as well, because you're considering what colours would be reflected onto the red from the green and, purple. It's a nice way to mix up your colour usage a little bit while still maintaining an element of realism. Although this is a heavily stylized, unrealistic image, it makes the piece seem more vibrant, and I love vibrancy. It feels alive, and when you get a good color combination, man, you just kind of, I don't know if this is just me, I just want to eat it. Like, when I see something that is visually kind of arresting, that has really good color usage, I just, it's my favorite thing. Also, once again, repeating shapes. Use that free transform warp tool as much as is feasibly possible, especially if you are somewhat running out of time, or you are struggling for ideas. It's a really great way to get bang for your buck if you are on a deadline or something. I'll also point out, don't those tiles that I've just done feel uncomfortable to you? Because they really feel uncomfortable to me. And that is because, where are those shapes anywhere? In that image, there is nothing that fits that shape. Like, we have got angles and we have got curves, but we haven't got kind of like W shapes, really. And you can tell I'm kind of putting them in there, but it doesn't feel quite right, because I'm looking for textures that make sense to me, because it's nice to define your materials, especially when you are trying to create something that feels grounded. But that is, it doesn't sit right, and it will go. Don't worry, it'll go. Another thing to consider when you are building a world is weather, and how the buildings and the environment will respond to that. So, for example, in this painting, the climate doesn't feel too out there right now. It feels lush. It feels like there would be rain. I'm aware that there's a little bit of a flaw in that it wouldn't be as rainy as you get higher up, but I'm not imagining this to be completely above all the clouds ever. There's just some lovely low-lying clouds kind of rolling across the plain in front of them. So with that in mind, I would expect there to be rain. And so I've given these buildings these little platforms, which I will go in later, and give them plants that they're growing on them, so that they can also be exposed to the important nutrients and the rain so that they can grow. I'm also considering composition right now, and considering the building. So I am repeating some elements of the shapes to some extent. You've got those kind of circular windows and the circular kind of feeling of the little under roof dome structures. It's difficult to describe them when they are fantastical, but something that is of a similar kind of color range just sitting in the background, because I'm aware that this image can be quite intense. It's one of my it's one of my failings as an artist, where I have a tendency to overload the viewer. I will just put in detail everywhere. Rest spaces for a viewer are really important. Places where it's a bit calm, where there isn't tons and tons of detail. And I'm trying to be more mindful of that, because we all have things that we need to work on. You can also see I keep flicking on and off the silhouette for those little kind of ships that I'm trying to be mindful of still. Just having it on another layer just to remember it, very much like the line art layer that I'll turn on every so often to make sure I'm going in the right direction, because it's so easy to get sucked into a painting and like lose sight of that creative vision. If there's one thing that I would really recommend, it's just maybe having it written down what you are looking to achieve in these images, in the image that you're working on, because I can forget it so easily. And it'll only take a moment of someone pointing it out to me to say, oh, I was planning to have more witches in this painting. Or, oh, I was planning to communicate more of a story, but now it's just a painting about rocks. And I think it is very difficult as artists for us to stay uh, almost open sometimes, because we get so sucked into these little compositions and images, and then you're trying to remember the larger scale thing as well as trying to communicate the smaller scale aspect of stuff. And especially if you're trying to get into the habit of remembering how to communicate things, I would really suggest writing down all the things that you kind of want to accomplish in your image. Because I lost sight of mine in this one. You'll see I just did the whole reduce method that I tend to employ when painting, where I just paint out stuff and then come back and put the detail back in, so I get the broad brush strokes done first. However, I just got rid of one of the greenhouses, and I, for a little while, end up forgetting that it's supposed to be about a flower delivery service. It just ends up being a nice place that's high up. And it can be really difficult when you are considering so many aspects of your painting to just remember that there's a big story behind it, because so often we all just get, like I absolutely do, just get sucked into the rendering of it, just get fixated on making it look cool in more of a brushwork and more of a color-based way, rather than what it's meaning and what it's telling the viewer. Something that is also fun to play with when you are trying to make a world look appealing or interesting is by using shadow or using paths to obviously lead your player into an area that is to be your focal point. Because I've got two focal points, or at least I'm hoping to at this point. In this image, which is going to be one by the house structure and one on this little plateau area in the foreground. And I want the player to be, not the player, too many days doing video games. I want the viewer to be drawn in. And so you've got this big sweeping curve that reaches round from the front and like moves through the middle distance, and then into the kind of mid-ground to background. But that kind of playing with that depth it's a lot of fun, but it also is a compositional tool. But having the areas that you want with to be a focal point, having an element of contrast to them, using that light up against the dark shadow, that's always one of the best ways to draw people's eye. That's the best way to tell people where you want them to look. So make sure that you're using a lot of shadow and light when you're creating these images, so that you could really kind of pull out the details that people are supposed to look at, especially if you're like me and you over detail absolutely everything. I think also you can end up inferring a lot of things with the foliage that you choose for your environment. For example, if you want something to feel fragile and it doesn't feel stable or safe, or it feels very new and risky, you don't want to use an oak tree, because the connotations that go along with that are solid and strong. But for this, I wanted it to feel safe, right? You want it, in this image, I wanted it to just feel like an ordinary day, a moment of calm. Nothing dramatic is happening. I wanted it to feel secure. And I mean, what feels more secure than when you're going for a walk in the woods, as long as you don't meet a serial killer, and you find just a really big oak tree or a really gnarled tree with really deep running roots. It feels like it's had time there, and it feels like it's got a sense of place. And by using things that have the visual language of what you're trying to achieve, so if you want to imply something has history, then you can, for example, let's see, if you wanted an environment to feel like it has history in terms of its rock usage, you would put moss on those rocks, because it has to be a stable-ish environment for that moss to grow. So you can use all of these little tricks to imply what the environment is like. If you just think about it a little bit and just kind of break down what you're trying to tell the player, this is all very instinctive. Like, I'm looking at it now and it makes a lot of sense to me why I made those choices. But back when I was just starting out with illustration, it didn't come quite as instinctively. So you'll see how I want this place to feel safe and secure, even though it's a rickety outpost on top of a mountain. So I've got these really strong, steady looking trees. I've got these rocks which have been there for a long time and they haven't been damaged and they haven't been torn up. And it's a precarious location, but everything's been there for a while. It would be scary, right, to be there, because it's a tiny, narrow wooden bridge leading onto a massive drop. But I don't think it comes across as particularly scary, because the bit with the massive drop has some pleasant lighting on it. It has lush textures. And I wouldn't be that worried, really, if I knew that trees that had been there for decades, possibly hundreds of years, were happily growing right there, and it was fine. Oh, and there's a nice bit of adding colour depth. I've pulled some of the more tealish, or the less green tones down from the sky. So I've put a little bit of blue into the shadow underneath the trees on the right side. So that's just another example of me moving colours around to make things feel cohesive. Because you've got to remember, the shadows are blue because of the reflected light from the sky. So, and that is especially a thing when it is sunny. You'll notice, I challenge you to go out when it's a sunny day and just take note of how all of those shadows are tinged with a lovely blue tone, because they've all got the reflected colour of the sky in them, which is what makes things feel a little bit summery or a little bit brighter when you use that shadow colour rather than the cool, diffuse grey of an overcast day. So, you know, little colour tips there. another tip for you, and I'm going to call myself out on something that was not my smartest hour. Maybe don't render out in high detail an entire section of your painting whilst leaving like a huge amount of it undecided. Like this was a good example of mild creative paralysis when experiencing an element of pressure. And it's good to have downtime, as I said, but as a result, I think I left that aspect, the foreground aspect of my painting, a little bit confused for a while. And, you know, I worked it out, but I probably could have balanced things a little bit better. It's difficult because although I am a big proponent of working organically, sometimes your gut is also slightly fearful and averse to doing something other than rendering rocks, because let's be real here, I love rendering rocks. It's great fun. I can look at rocks pretty much all day, but sometimes we have to do things that are scary. So I would advise, like, don't ignore massive sections of your painting just because it's easier. At this point, I'm trying to get the atmosphere feeling quite right because it feels a little bit too clear, if that makes sense. You just saw me getting some kind of cloud lines in. I'm blending out the horizon a little bit. I think it is perhaps a little bit distracting. It's very interesting creating images for magazines and for specific uses because you've got to play into composition stuff that you wouldn't always consider for a just regular painting. Like, I'm trying to be mindful of where the subject line will go, so that's going to go in that big yawning space of blue sky. But I'm trying to like soften elements up because I want to make sure that the focal points are pretty focal. Those clouds, I think they're sharp, and that's okay. And I'm glad that I've got some sharpness to them, but I want to kind of blend it out a little bit. I want it to feel a little bit more mysterious in the distance. So that means putting in more fog and more atmospheric perspective, and making it less about having three kind of towering cloud pillars and more drifting mist over the horizon. I also still want to have a little bit more texture in the sky. I've put a little bit of chalky texture up there, and also the hint of more clouds in the distance, because I didn't want it, as I said, to feel like this is completely above everything. I want it to feel high up, um, but it still wants to feel livable. So I'm going to pay more attention to the sky at that point. Also, very small detail here, but on the far left cloud, I've blurred out one of those edges because I want it to feel a little bit more dreamy. Playing around with edges and the effects that you can get if you want a sharp edge and then a softer edge, it really pulls the form of that sharp edge forward. And then, as you can see, I've blended it out like the cloud itself has lost a bit of its form on the left side. And that kind of makes it feel a little bit more hazy. And I'm trying to get that hazy feeling as much as is feasibly possible, because I am struggling between the really blocky forms of clouds and the atmosphere that I'm trying to communicate. Because as much as I wanted this really sunny, kind of fresh morning feel, I think I do end up losing it to some extent, because the process that I'm going through kind of takes me in a different direction, which is a shame, because I really like that feeling. It still feels, I think, fresh, but I end up tipping a bit further toward summer rather than spring, because you can see I've used those richer golden tones in the horizon line. So where the fields are, or whatever the earth in the distance is, I've used kind of oranges and kind of warm greens. You can see now I'm finally trying to pay attention to the foreground of the image by repeating the forms that I've done on the right side with the rocks, with the bright green to make it look nice and lush. I think it became very clear once again that that kind of dark tan color, very desaturated dark tan color, was only serving to make the painting feel dry and a bit desolate. And the more and more that I worked into getting these darker tones, because like basic value stuff, make sure you've got like some dark values at the front of an image if you want it to feel I mean, you can break this rule, obviously, but as a general rule, it's good to have the dark values as close as possible, because things get more neutral as they move further away from the camera. So get those dark values in there for a nice bit of depth, and then realize that the environment that you're communicating in your painting doesn't quite match up. And then remember to flip your paintings again so that you realise that things once again feel slightly unbalanced. I definitely find this. I don't know if you find this as well. Because I am right-handed, everything seems to end up tilting slightly one way. And I don't know if that's just the way that I paint. Largely because I imagine when you're making a line, the way that your hand moves outward probably affects the angle at which you draw straight lines. You're never really drawing purely straight lines. But it's always good to know what your failings are and keep them in mind, because everyone's got things that they kind of suck at a little bit, and that's perfectly fine. And I always tilt everything to the side. I've also added more detail in the foreground. It's always nice to have something that lets you know, it kind of frames the edge of a painting if you've got something that's close up to the camera that's a really dark value. It's also nice because you get to repeat some of the plants that I'll end up drawing an awful lot of in the rest of the image. up close to the camera, because if you know how large that's supposed to be, then it gives you a visual anchor for the scale of things. Obviously there's going to be figures in there, like you can't go wrong with a bit of scale birds or scale humans, but it helps having those things up close. It gives your viewer a little bit more context of the foliage and the world that you're kind of building. Also, this is me going in again, trying to define that misty feeling, as well as some drifting bits of fog. Very early on in my first sketch, I had a lot of these bits of fog that would wrap themselves around the cliff edge, because that just kind of feels pleasant and dreamy and a little bit fantastical, because this is still a fantastical image. As well as just making it feel, yeah, a little bit higher up and a little bit magical in a pleasant way. It also, having that slight gradient makes, like, really drives home where this place is set. And now I get to do the exciting bit, which is actually designing the ship that I've been putting off. So you can see I've got the roof shape, and now I'm going to go and draw those plants that I was doing little doodles of earlier. I was thinking that basically that could capture all the water and it would allow for just nice transportation. It doesn't seem like a particularly windy environment, and if it doesn't go super fast, it's still got that streamlined shape, given it's got the sharper front and then it curves round to allow for aerodynamics. But I mean, it's kind of a big bubble, and it's got air brakes and it's got little arm rudders. It's very technical. I don't know if you can tell. But it's got some thought into how it works. This is also where I like to get into how it functions. So there's a little panel on top that would be grippy for when people are standing on it and putting the plants in. That rolled up thing is also a unrollable ladder for how people get up. I think my neighbour is doing some drilling. That's great. And you've got things like air brakes, and you've got the bubble kind of viewing window and the doors. It's really fun to get into how this all works. I absolutely adore it. Round about this time, I decided to go in and just change up the colour a little bit. It wasn't quite sitting well with me. It wasn't vibrant enough. So I use a hue and saturation, brightness and contrast and curves layer to just bring the brightness up a little bit. I'm a big fan of vibrant colours, and especially when you're working on different monitors, I'd recommend changing it around, seeing what looks better on which monitor. I sometimes export a JPEG to look at the colour on my phone, because a big part of something looking bright and colourful is the colours matching what you intend them to look like. I find that my dark values don't fit as well as I think they do, because I've got a very saturated monitor that I usually paint on. And then it turns out that my colour is super washed out and my dark values aren't great, because I've been working on something where the dark tones and the kind of really saturated, almost black kind of bits in the painting just aren't nearly as dark as I thought. So definitely pay attention to that. What I'm doing right now is using the lasso tool to just make some quick shapes for plants, because in my mind, the reason why those ledges are there on those rooftops is because they'll catch a lot of rain, once again breaking down the purpose of things. And so the flowers would grow well there. I'm just quickly blocking in some colour. I originally took the colour orange from those rooftops, but it didn't feel quite right. This is definitely one of those moments where I'm searching for a kind of visual solution, and that's okay. I think throwing colour down is always useful, but I really recommend, if you can, getting another pair of eyes on your image just to tell you what is wrong or what can be improved upon, because I always do my best work, and I'm sure many people agree, when I'm bouncing my ideas off someone. So in these kind of moments, I'll ask for feedback, I'll ask for a paint over from a friend, just because it will only result in more ideas. You only have a limited amount of experience, and it's perfectly fine to say you don't know something. And when you can get someone else's input, it opens you up to all sorts of new possibilities. And doing art in a vacuum, it's just not fun. So I definitely recommend bouncing your thoughts off another person. Although I haven't mentioned brushes that much, I've included one of the main brush that I use in this is kind of hard round chalky brush. I use it for almost everything in this painting. It's an absolutely wonderful little tool that allows for a lot of blending at the beginning, but it drops off quite sharply. It can pretty much give you solid block color if you need it to. I work with the transparency at the top turned off and on an awful lot, just so that I can get the forms that I want. I've also used this kind of carving in method that I talk about in the tutorial, where I'll make a shape and, still using paint, as you can see here, rather than erasing it, just painting it out. I don't tend to use the eraser very much unless I'm strictly working on layers, but I don't like working with layers that much. People always despair in my streams because I will just merge absolutely everything down. But I think it encourages you to kind of commit to the choices that you're making. I think it sometimes can be a bit scary if you're making a big decision and then I will, for example, cut something out. But if I want to make these quick forms, especially with grass, I'll throw down some shapes and then cut into them. And then you get these little artifacts, especially if you're underpainting with like some bolder colours, of underlying hints of colour that just come through and make your image pop a little bit more. I also realised that this lower foreground area is looking very dry. It doesn't match the midground, which is much more lush. I originally planned for this because it was supposed to be a pathway, but it just isn't sitting with me, and it doesn't contrast in a pleasant way, as opposed to contrasting in a nice way like a colour. It confuses the message, which is not the kind of contrast that you're after when you're trying to focus on world building and storytelling. So I'm trying to make all the surfaces have a slightly more lush aspect to them. I also didn't want it to be overpoweringly green images. I think there's some kind of scientific research that says they're not that striking. Something like green covers don't sell. I don't know. So I'm just putting in some more pink flowers, some more contrast to make it a little bit more exciting. And this is the bit that I love in an image. I've spent a long time rendering. Now I get to finally set dress. So I think about, they're a florist or they grow flowers. How do they live there? They've got these bubble windows as greenhouses, but then I love flower boxes, so I'm going to put some flower boxes in there. I'm going to give them a kind of cliff top lookout balcony. Also, it doesn't really make a lot of sense if they're just bubbles, so as you can see, I'm hinting at plant life on the inside. Plants coming out of the top of the building. Essentially, I'm just trying to make it striking. Also, the kind of curved shapes of the roof tiles that I mentioned before, they are now gone because it just didn't sit correctly. They wouldn't make sense in terms of the edges of the roof tiles. So I'm trying to maintain consistency there. I also want to make sure that in the composition with that purple tower that it's not letting the viewer's eye kind of lead off the page. I've got this nice sweeping composition and I want to redirect any viewing that goes astray, as it were. So I use those vines to just point the composition back toward the greenhouses, the plants, and then it'll eventually loop back round, as you'll see later on. And some more plant life. It just makes things feel pleasant, giving your world a consistent variety. It still has a theme, right? But it has variety and it makes the world feel like it has more to it than just some grass and some oak trees. I also added a drain pipe there because I'm a sucker for communicating mundane details. I think there's a lot of beauty in mundanity that you can find. It's just how people live their life. I'm fascinated by people, and I love seeing the way that people approach decoration and making an area pleasant. When I was in Japan, my favorite part of it was going around the streets of downtown Osaka and seeing how each individual apartment and each house had decorated their balconies or how they had hung their laundry out to dry, because it's a different kind of approach to decoration. It's still deeply personal, but it's fascinating to see how other cultures do it, because you can just take all of that and put it into your own images. And I am just adding some little hanging baskets here from pink ribbons, taking that pink from the flowers and the roof tiles, because it'll make the silhouette more interesting. Like, hanging things are fun to look at, and it adds that personal touch. That's the shape of an inverted roof, because it also helps communicate what they do. Why? I mean, they really love flowers. You're definitely getting that. But why have they got all of this kind of just on every inch of where they live? Oh, and as a quick note, in case you aren't sure what I'm doing, when I'm constantly pressing Alt, I'm color picking just all the time. It's got to the point where I'm having a small war because I can't get my Surface Pro 4 to color pick as successfully as I'd like, and it's making me have a small meltdown. So I, as I said, move color around an image constantly. I think it's really important, especially in worlds that aren't supposed to feel incredibly decadent and rich, to consider wear and tear. I just added a bunch of damage onto that ship's roof because it's probably quite old. I can't imagine that if you're doing all of these delivery services to far off locations, that it'd be a very glamorous job, that you'd make a lot of money doing it. So I like to keep that in mind. You very rarely see a world that is flawless or doesn't have any signs of age or damage, unless that's the inherent message that you're trying to communicate. If you think about those dystopian worlds like in Mirror's Edge, that are flawless and beautiful. That's because they're trying to communicate this sense of an incredibly controlled society that, you know, steps on the little person for the sake of things looking and seeming perfect. And so it's unlikely, is what I'm trying to say, that things would be flawless. So get that wear and tear in there. Think about where your object can be damaged. This is really relevant for 3D artists as well. Think about how the scene that you're creating, or the props that you're putting in the scene, how they'd be handled or touched or crashed into, and how that might affect them being damaged, or how they'd appear. I find that flaking paint or sun-bleached plaster makes the world feel like it has a history. You want to imply that the place that is that you're creating in your scene has a history, and you want to leave clues for your viewer to figure it out for themselves. I've also moved the ship over because I needed a focal point there, and I didn't like where it was when it was next to the house, because they are essentially two focal points competing for your attention. And if you kind of look at the direction that the ship is pointing now, the roof points down the pathway, which sweeps across the wooden bridge and takes you to the house, which forms a nice compositional swoop. It enforces it even more. And because the viewer tends to, like, as a general rule, we tend to approach a composition from the left-hand side, like we're reading a book. Having something that immediately draws your eye, especially if it's got high contrast, which is something that I'm currently painting in, if it draws your eye, then you're going to follow that line that it's pointing in. And I'm hoping that by putting that there, I'll create a compositional loop that keeps the viewer have their eyes continuing to move around the image rather than drifting off the edge of the canvas. This is another consideration of practicality. I felt like the roof still didn't make as much sense as I like, even though it had the streamlined aspect for it. So I thought it could be fun if there were almost bored-in holes that could have individual plants placed in them, so that they'd be reasonably secure. I can't imagine this ship goes particularly quickly, let's be honest here. But had these interesting forms, because I was finding the completely pink roof a little bit overbearing, and this also allows for some aspects of the plants to come into the light, and you get to put some nice bright hints on them, which also draws people's attention, and it allows for that direct kind of aquamarine to coral pink directly next to each other kind of thing, which immediately draws your eye because it's a complementary colour structure, and it's strong to look at as well. Now this is the point where I start being able to do my favourite thing, which is implying what's happening at that very moment. I am trying to show what is midway through being done. I remember getting some brilliant advice when it came to gesture, and I think that can absolutely be applied to storytelling as well. That when you are creating a pose, you don't want to show the beginning or the end of a pose because it just comes across as stiff. It doesn't have the movement because the muscles are now rested in the position that they either started or are ending in. What you want to do is capture that mid-movement kind of moment. And I act, as I say in the tutorial, I act gestures out because I think you get the feel for it. I'm, as you can tell, a very instinctive painter. And because of that, I kind of like to feel out the way that I'm approaching an image. And I think that this whole capture mid-moment ethos can be applied to environments as well. So at the moment, in my mind, the ship is midway through being loaded up. So you've got that basket that sits on the top of the roof. And I am going to add in a moment, I imagine, ways to climb onto that roof and signs that the job is only halfway done, which I think is more interesting and raises more questions than that is a person loading an airship. Okay, so this is when I got really fed up with the lack of scale, and so decided that I was going to increase the ship quite sizably so that I could raise that foreground ground plane up a bit, because the two ground planes that you see that are connected by the wooden bridge, they were kind of just stuck on the same horizontal plane, which means that it's not a very dynamic image. There's no change in verticality, which is just a fancy word of saying like which bit is higher than another. And that's dull to look at, and it wasn't communicating scale well either. I wanted there are going to be figures in there, but the door already to the house, it doesn't feel right when it has a small ship. So I'm increasing the scale of the ship so that it feels like you are going downhill. And I'm going to go in with free transform and warp and use perspective and skew just to kind of make it feel like it's on more of a downward slope. Also, little trick there, use content aware for when you're trying to fill in gaps that you have free transformed information out of. So that is edit, fill, content aware. And I'm just adding in some really rough, rocky steps to increase the feeling of walking downward toward that house. I want to push it back a lot further than it is right now. It doesn't help that I haven't applied much fog or atmospheric perspective, because right now it is all the same kind of value and colour. And I'd say right now, don't be afraid to massively change your composition. Photoshop has all of these amazing tools for a reason, and take advantage of them. If you want to completely reinvent your composition, even if it's a bit scary, absolutely do it. I will trust my gut now. If I'm spending ages trying to get something to work, there is very little point in me just struggling against it, because I can guarantee you, if I go away from an image which has had a problem that I have spent 3 hours trying to solve, if I sleep on it and I just relax, I will be able to solve it in about half an hour the next day. Okay, this is something that was bothering me because I didn't feel like the wood entirely fitted with the world. And I'm not sure it does, but I changed it to metal with some wire kind of wrapped around the planks just to make it feel a little less traditional fantasy. I'm still not entirely sure if it was the right choice making it wood, but I think I may have fallen into that trap of really liking the highlights and the rendering, which is bad. Don't do that. And I think you can tell I was quite tired when I was doing this because I've actually done the rope ladder that you use to climb up. I think the opposite way round, really. Like the perspective is flipped. And I'm not really thinking about it properly. And that's okay. Sometimes you will just have moments where you will look and realize that you have horribly messed up. Like we've all drawn a hand with 6 fingers, right? We've all done that. Sometimes you're just a little bit too in the moment and you might not be paying quite as much attention as you should have done, because you are happily rendering away, and that's okay. Because once again, Photoshop can fix that. You'll see me realize in a minute. And I'm just considering miniature compositions, like for example, those flower buckets just by the rope ladder. Those will kind of help tell a little story, a job not entirely finished. When you're doing set dressing, this is a quality game art tip for you. If you are ever doing set dressing in an environment, whether it be a concept, an illustration, or a 3D scene, use the rule of 3 and 5. Always put objects together in miniature scenes of 3 or 5. The brain orders even numbers way too quickly, and having a couple of rocks and a tree, or a small collection of books and some candles, believe me, it will work so much better if you use it in an odd number and vary the scale. And here we go. Here is me realizing that I ruined the perspective. But I can fix it as well through witchcraft. Alternatively, free transform. I'm using the overlay and multiply layer modes just to add a little bit of the sky reflection. So some blue tones in the shadows and then pushing those highlights a bit more. I also absolutely couldn't resist making a painting that didn't involve these tiny flags because this is pretty much my signature move. But consider how people would have railings. Railings have design. Absolutely everything has design. There are very few things in life that have just been hastily thrown together. I also I got a comment from my housemate who thought that things weren't entirely linking up the way that in my mind they were. She thought that the little kind of rooftops and the purple tower was separate, and that the bubbles weren't entirely linked. So I put in another bubble to kind of suggest that, and another one there, just to suggest that they are kind of a part of the same building, using repeating elements. Okay, now it's time for a fun bit, adding in characters. So this is where you get to consider the posture, that you want to convey. Like, characters are always important for adding scale, and I want this person to feel relaxed and maybe a little bit lazy, just chilling out when they maybe should be doing a delivery, perhaps on their phone, and just pushing those gestures a little bit more. I always work in curve. You can really get some nice results if you push that gesture, like these casually thrown out leg balancing on an ankle. You push the curve out a little bit further to a point where some people would say it would look like it would be broken in real life, but this is a stylized image, so it's fine. Also, it's taken me many years to get out of this terrible, terrible habit, but I really like to over detail things. Compulsively over detail faces. I'm pretty sure that if you paint characters, you have absolutely done a really rough sketch and then just rendered the face for ages, realize you've horribly over rendered the face, can't paint anything else because the face is too detailed, and you're just stuck with an image that you are not happy with. And with that in mind, I am trying to render this character, obviously with more detail than, for example, those plants that they're standing next to, but not go all out on adding facial details. I've implied the shadow of the nose and the shadows of the fingers, but I'm not going to go any further than that because it's not needed. And more than that, it will be distracting if you don't have that level of rendering across the entire image. Once again, free transform will save your life. Don't forget to add a shadow because you want your characters to look as grounded as is feasibly possible. So I think that is the delivery driver slacking off a bit on their delivery. But what is also super interesting to do is to set that off against perhaps a new character, like having, here we go, a second character. So this provides scale so that you know how much further back this person is. But also, as humans, we follow eyeline. And I really want to reinforce that compositional loop, right? So what a good compositional trick to use is to point the eyeline, make a character look in the direction that you want the viewer to look, because we usually will. So I want to throw that viewer's gaze once they reach this character back to the ship, because that creates a nice circle, a nice loop all the way around the image that will keep a viewer in, and hopefully a few unintentional repetitions around the image will let them absorb some of the smaller details which I've spent so long trying to create. So I'm having this character look over at the other, and I enjoy the implication of, why are they looking over? Is there more going on? What is the nature of their relationship? Is it one-sided? Is this person interested in the other person? It can be very interesting. It's to play with expectation, make the viewer ask questions, because if you put two and two together, that makes you feel like you've discovered something in an image. And I think discovering things in images or in books or in films, those tiny details make you feel like you found your own little bit of history. And I think that allowing the viewer to figure things out for themselves is such a massive part of creating engaging worlds. You have to give the viewer enough credit to figure out all of those little details that you've hidden in things, because it is so rewarding and addictive when you do. Okay, so this is the finished image for this tutorial on world building. I hope you found it really useful. I really enjoyed putting it together. I'd like to say thank you to Claire Howlett and ImagineFX for giving me this opportunity. I hope this has given you lots of ideas for how you can put stories and more detail into your images, and that's really exciting for you. If you want to check out my work, I am at annahollinrake.com. I'm on Twitter a lot at Anna Hollinrake, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you very much.